Hello, everyone. My name is Jamille Pinheiro. I'm the co-director of the Environmental Humanities Research Hub at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's event, which is part of our Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities series. Before we begin, I would like to thank Ståle Holgersen for joining us today, as well as my co-organizer, Gianfranco Selgas, for helping to make this conversation possible. Many thanks as well to Kathy Collins for her support behind the scenes, and of course to all of you for being here with us. The Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities series is dedicated to fostering interdisciplinary and transnational dialogues that advance environmental humanities research in its most expansive and engaged forms. Please note that this session is being recorded. We will have a Q&A at the end, so feel free to use the chat if you would like to ask a question. I will now hand over to Gianfranco, who will introduce our guest speaker. And again, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to the discussion. Gianfranco, over to you.
Thank you, Jamille, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm just going to say a few words about today's talk and introduce our guest speaker today, Ståle Holgersen. So what do we mean when we say we are in a crisis? In his new book, so I have it here, Against the Crisis, Economy and Ecology in a Burning World, published last year by Verso, Ståle Holgersen offers a sharp and urgent dissection of the crisis paradigm. Drawing on decades of Marxist theory and reworking it for an age of ecological breakdown, Holgersen challenges dominant assumptions about capitalism, collapse, and political possibility. As noted by scholar Alyssa Battistoni, Against the Crisis, and I quote, is a sharp, panoramic, and fiercely principled, end quote, a vital resource for understanding how crises are produced, who they serve, and how the left might respond with clarity and purpose. Rather than treating crisis as an exception or opportunity, Ståle's talk today will invite us to rethink its structure, function, and implications in our volatile world. Ståle Holgersen is a senior lecturer in human geography at Stockholm University, Sweden. Apart from Against the Crisis, he's the author of Kris I bostadsfrågan, which translates as Crisis in the Housing Question, published by Daedalus in 2023, and authored by the research collective Fundament, Political Ecologies of the Far Right, which was published last year by Manchester University Press and co-edited with Irma Kinga Allen, Christopher Ekberg, and Andreas Malm, and White Skin Black Fuel on the Danger of Fossil Fascism, published by Verso in 2021, and co-authored by the activist research Zetkin Collective. Ståle's research focuses on class, crisis, and climate, with particular attention to urban and social geography, sustainable development, and climate denialism, and his current work explores the class dimensions of the Norwegian oil sector. Ståle, thank you for being with us today, and very welcome.
Thank you. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
So much for having me, Jamille and Gianfranco, and thank you everybody for zooming in. Yes, I'm going to speak a little bit about the book for like 20-25 something minutes, and we have a discussion afterwards. And so the title of the book is Against the Crisis, but to get the session more spicy, we threw in a polycrisis in the title of the session, which is a spicy concept, and I have my problems with it. So I will try to use the polycrisis concept to get into the core of my own book. So the whole book is not about polycrisis, don't worry, but it's just this way of getting into the core for my own sake. Okay, so we're living today in the 2020s, and we are seeing so much talk about crisis around us. Economic, ecological, political, ideological crisis, social crisis, and everything else is a crisis as well these days. Wars, you heard just the war in Ukraine crisis, and in the polycrisis concept, you find all kind of IT security being a crisis. Everything that's related to something bad can basically today be called a crisis. This is a problem. So if everything is a crisis, nothing is a crisis. If the concept used for everything, it loses meaning. It doesn't make sense anymore. So I think either we come down with a more narrow definition to figure out what it actually means, or we stop using it. And I think stop using it will be a problem because there are some things happening in the world that should be called, I think, be called crisis. There's some kind of phenomena that are out there in the real world that are crisis and some that's not crisis, I would say. So I'll come back to this. So I think that polycrisis concept has two core problems that it shares with so much of the crisis talk today. So the first one is that it lacks a definition. It can basically be anything bad can be associated with the polycrisis, because it's just an enormous mountain of bad things going on. It's all a polycrisis. The other problem is it's unclear how these different crises are related. Okay, so I will go through these two questions because they also open up the discussion on what is a crisis, and I will show you how I define a crisis and how I work with what I mean is and is not a crisis as such. Okay, so the book is about economic and ecological crisis, no more, no less. So it could be also political and social crisis and ideological, which I'm not dealing with. It's economic and ecological. Okay, let's start with the first problem for polycrisis then, which is the lack of definition. And trying to define a concept like crisis is not a small task, of course. And I will now present my definition, and that's maybe very ambitious to do so. And if somebody else, I'm quite open-minded here, I think, if somebody else come up with a better definition, I'm very happy to change my view. But so far, I have not met anybody with a better definition, so I keep to my own. So it's two main problems with trying to come up with a definition of such a concept. The main path we should avoid. The first one is the classical going to the dictionary, or trying to figure out what it really meant in Old Greek or in Latin, Old Latin or something. That first, it normally comes up with a synonym rather than a definition. But second, also misses the fact that not only language, but also the real world we are trying to describe with our language changes over time. So using the same concept for the same thing over 2,000 years, for example, with a thing like crisis, which is social relation, a social process, doesn't make sense. Okay, or does not necessarily make sense. Second main problem or mistake you can do when trying to define something is everything goes. Okay, if you think that is a crisis, you might say that's not a crisis, but a computer, etc. So if we all can mean whatever we want for the crisis, we have a very hard time communicating. So if we try to figure out the definition of what crisis means today, we need to be sensitive to the history of the concept and sensitive to how the world changes, and try to figure out which kind of concepts out there in the real, I'm a critical realist, in the real world that we want to kind of nail with this concept. So inspired by Daniel Ben Said and his use of seeing crisis as a paroxysm, which is a certain outbreak of a known disease, and inspired by Bob Jessop, who speaks about crisis as a symptomatology, which is symptom of something underlying. I think I use these kind of approaches to come up with the definition of crisis as something that almost always must exist on different levels. So here's my definition. Everything I say from now will be, as soon as I say the word crisis, is based on this definition. So if people have a different definition, of course, we have a problem, but at least now we can have a disagreement. If we don't have a definition, we can only have confusion. And I prefer disagreements to confusion. So here's my definition. A crisis is a social paroxysm, which means it's some kind of turning point on an event necessarily built on three components. First is an event happening relatively quickly. This event, second, is embedded in underlying structures or processes. And third, this must have somehow negative consequences for human or nature. Without the first one, without the event, we can have all kind of permanent problems. Without the second one, if this is not embedded underlying structural processes, we can have all kind of things happening by chance. And without the third one, we can hypothetically have stuff that's good for absolutely everyone, and we just need to rule that out of the definition. So this means that crises are things happening in the real world that necessarily exist on different levels of abstraction. It's both an event, spectacular event, and something underlying, always. It's both concrete and abstract. That is kind of at the core of this very phenomenon. This also means that purely philosophical arguments about crisis or purely empirical arguments on crisis will always fall short, because the phenomena itself doesn't allow for that. It necessarily forces us to go back and forth from the empirical to the abstract and theoretical. That's at the core. That's what the concept demands from us. This means that everything is not a crisis. Poverty, for example, is not a crisis. So poverty is something bad, and poverty can lead to social crisis. Economic crisis can lead to poverty, but poverty as such is more or less a permanent feature in capitalism. And something that's more or less permanent over decades and centuries should not be called crisis. Crisis is something coming and going. Okay. And already here we have differences between economic and ecological crisis, but I'll come back to that. So this is my definition of crisis. So it means that someone like Jared Diamond will be wrong when he says a crisis can come out of nowhere. And someone like the Danish anthropologist Henrik Wiig is wrong when he says that now we're in a new state where the crisis is permanent. So then I have a disagreement. I come with a different approach and different definition. Okay, that was my argument for a definition. Now I'm going to try something here. You see my slide? Charlotte Fraser, you're the only one with the camera on, so I ask you. You see?
Yes, we say.
Thanks, Gianfranco. So this was the answer to how do we define a crisis. Then the next question: how do crises relate to each other? How do two different crises, like economic and ecological crisis, relate to each other? And with my definition, crises must exist on different levels of abstraction. That's an ontological fact. But how many? So it must be at least two levels. But how many levels? That's more a discursive practice, so to speak. So in this presentation, or this way of putting it forward, I'll try to work with 5 levels. And if you so this presentation will be short. I'll do this very, very quickly. And if you don't, I don't have time to explain everything in this table, just to show you how I think about the relation between the crises. So just super quickly, for example, on economic crisis, on level 1 as a shock, the surface, the event, we have 29, 73, 2008, 2020. But there's also a lot of stock market crashes. One last year, one of the biggest in the history of capitalism, exactly a year ago. Nobody cares, nobody remembers, because it didn't lead to a crisis. To understand how some crashes leads to a huge crisis or they don't, we need to go down to level 2. How is the economy organized at a certain point when this shock enters the economy? And there we find regime of accumulation and Fordism and neoliberalism, etc. How you want to find it. So, but this doesn't tell us, just because we have Fordism or neoliberalism doesn't tell us why we necessarily get the economic crisis. Then we need to go into the very tendencies inherent in capitalism. And I will not spend time on this here, but in Marxist crisis literature, of course, concepts like overproduction and increasing organic composition of capital leading to falling of profit are being debated, and as arguments for why capitalism necessarily produces crisis. Okay. We stop economic crisis there and go to ecological crisis just as quickly. On level 1, on the surface, we found ecological crisis when they kill people. Heat waves, storms, wildfires, etc. But to understand, for example, why there are more wildfires now because of global warming, but there were still, of course, wildfires before global warming. But to understand, and we cannot know which would have existed without or with global warming. Some would, some wouldn't, but we don't know which, if you know what I mean. If to understand why there are more, but we cannot know exactly which, we need to work with our levels of abstraction. So on level 2, organization of capitalism, we find use of fossil fuel, deforestation, etc. But this doesn't tell us why capitalism necessarily produces an unsustainable relation to nature. Deforestation doesn't explain why it's deforestation. So to understand inherent tendencies, I basically go to John Bellamy Foster and the concept of metabolic rift. And I do accept some criticism and some limits with the concept. Maybe we can discuss that later. But I do think it's the least poor concept to describe how relations between humans and nature changes under capitalism compared to non-capitalist societies. Okay, my argument would be that so far we have not seen a proper relation between the two crises. So far, on these 3 levels, 2 crises exist on different planets, which means I'm critical of James O'Connor's argument that ecological crisis causes economic crisis, for example. But they might trigger one like 2020. But on a deeper level, what are really necessarily relations between the two crises? We go down to level 4. And level 5, we find on level 4 the profit motive. And if you go more abstract into it, level 5, use value versus exchange value. And then suddenly, they're not only related, but they're standing on the same ground. And this also speaks into the discussion between Jason Moore and John Bellamy Foster. If the two crises are... So Jason Moore would say that ecological crisis are one crisis. John Bellamy Foster would say now are 2 different crises. I would say, well, that depends on level of abstraction. Okay. But as events, they are deeply, deeply different, of course. So, so this was kind of my way of saying how crises are related. So polycrisis normally, and liberal views of crisis in the larger society, mainstream media, or whatever you want to call it, normally relation between these crises on level 1. So with the pandemic, for example, it becomes interesting. Did the pandemic cause economic crisis? A purely level 1 kind of relation. How much does climate change cost? You normally start calculating how much wildfires and heat waves cost in economic, and then in economic terms, and then you start with this cost and economic crisis. It's sometimes closer to level 2, but very often the strictly level 1 kind of discussion we have when speaking about relation between the crises. I insist if you want to see the proper relation between them, you need to go down to level, what I call level 4 or 5. So this was not only a way of seeing how they are related, but this is also one of my 2 arguments in the book. So in this book, there's 2 main, maybe not arguments, but main approaches. One of the main approaches is that capitalism produces crises in a way we have never seen before in the history of mankind. And this is how I try to understand and describe that. With this table, I can see how, okay, because of the profit motive, because of the underlying mechanisms in capitalism, use value, exchange value, contradiction, we necessarily get these kind of crises. That's one of the key approaches in the book. The other key approach, maybe a more controversial, is that crises also reproduce capitalism. There's 2 different arguments. One is that capitalism produces crisis. The other one is that crises reproduce capitalism, which is also an argument against all kind of collapse theory, where people think that the crisis will bring us some kind of collapse or socialism or whatever. What crisis normally brings us is more capitalism. So in order to understand that or try to figure out how that is, I do not use this kind of method with a table. I use a different kind of method. I basically go through a lot of things that I think are relevant to understand in our society, for understanding how that can be the case. That crises are reproduced, or capitalism is reproduced, one crisis after the other. And this will go maybe even faster than the previous slide. So fasten your seatbelts. I go through a lot of these phenomena or these social processes in the real world. Look at the crisis itself, for example. With economic crisis, the economic crisis, this is different between economic and ecological crisis. With economic crisis, we have creative destruction. So through the crisis itself, the crisis is solved. With ecological crisis, it's very different. There's no creative destruction in the same sense, but so capitalism don't need the economic. So with the economic crisis, the capitalism needs the economic crisis as a crisis to reproduce itself. With ecological crisis, the system doesn't really need an ecological crisis, but it needs to produce the ecological crisis in order to exist in the first place. Okay, super shortly, shock, building on Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, saying that in a moment of turbulence and shock, those with military, economic, social, political power are best positioned to use it. Relative autonomy of the state is very important in terms of how not only crisis, but how the whole system is reproduced. And also it's a very good tool to understand how stuff like economic and ecological crisis don't necessarily become political crisis. Because it is very interesting question, why hasn't climate change led to a massive crisis of legitimation in the political system, 2 decades ago? And I think the relative autonomy of the state is a very important key to understand why. The class character of the crises, they are the same in both crises, they strike downwards. So, for example, how would people react if climate change killed the very, very richest first? Say that if we reach 2%, everybody knows that all the dollar billionaires will be dead. How will we react then? We don't know, because that's counterfactual. That's not how it is. We know exactly how it is. It's the opposite. Poor people die first. And that's also a reason why the ruling class and political elites can ignore it. And I discussed the role of nationalism and racism and fascism and wars, which I will not have time to go into here, but also to understand different kind of processes through which crisis reproduce capitalism. And also the last one says ... So I discuss quite a lot of things here, but I don't discuss all kind of things, which doesn't mean that those things I don't discuss are less important. It's just that my intellectual capacity is limited. Questions of gender, questions of colonialism or imperialism, questions of psychoanalysis is not discussed here. Doesn't mean that it's not important. It's just that I didn't have the capacity. All right, and time and whatever to do it. Okay, so this is, if we put them together then, how capitalism produces crisis and crisis reproduces capitalism, we can start having fun. Then we can start doing analysis on all kind of crisis and see what kind of processes was mostly important in which kind of crisis, etc. We can do starting empirical work. I think this is a useful framework to start doing work on particular crisis. Okay, so just a final comment if I have time. Gianfranco, 2 minutes more? Yes?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. Yeah.
Super, because just one final reflection then, coming back to why I think my definition is important, because today we live in, 2020s, and the way people speak about crisis is very different from the 2010s. In the 2010s, the ruling class and the political elites did whatever they can to avoid any crisis. The whole economic policy was to avoid economic crisis, save neoliberalism or whatever we're going to call it, save status quo. That was kind of the mission. After 2020, especially now especially last year with Trump, something changed dramatically. And not only Trump, but since 2022, in 2022, I think Polycrisis was the year in the world in Financial Times. So Polycrisis was spoke about in Davos, in the corridors of power. This is the language of the elites. Suddenly, after 2020, the elites start speaking about crisis in a very different way from 2010s. I think now it's very clear that the elites are not trying to avoid any crisis anymore. Maybe they have finally read Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. I don't know, but they are living it. They are doing it. They are waiting for crisis. They're waiting for using crisis. And there quotes not only from Trump, but even Keir Starmer has quotes saying the people demand us to use next crisis in order to advance Britain or something. And you see also Trump especially want to use crisis, but not only use crisis, but also create crisis. And this creates a dilemma for my definition, right? Or not dilemma. What they are trying to create is what we can call, and what Naomi Klein calls in shock doctrine, a pseudo-crisis. And I think this is very interesting. So they are partly trying to trigger crisis or trigger a sense of shock. So when Trump introduced tariffs, for example, he could introduce tariffs 0.1% each month for a year, like gradually, so people could adapt. He didn't. He came out with a homemade sign on the in front of the world media. Listen, people, here's a shock, 40%, 30%, whatever. It was meant to be a shock, and it was. And I think this is the kind of the way the ruling class in general, but Trump in particular, are trying to use crisis, but also create crisis. And then we can speak about pseudo-crisis, which is things that appear as crisis or created by the elites in order to use the turbulence that follow from it, but it's not rooted in underlying structural processes. So when Trump, for example, sends in the National Guards here and there, just to shut down some demonstrations that didn't exist, or when this enormous attack on trans people, which is some kind of danger to society that doesn't exist, is a way of trying to create crisis. And this is I would call it pseudo-crisis. And this is a very different phenomena from real crisis. Because real crisis, like economic and ecological crisis, are actually stuff that come organically out of societies, of capitalism, out of the class relations in society, and have real effect. And there's no single politicians can stop climate change or stop an economic crisis. The process is bigger than that. But these kind of pseudo-crises are very different in form, and we need to think politically and sociologically about the differences between these. And just calling everything a polycrisis doesn't make sense, because we need to understand the relation between the crisis, and some of these components are not real crisis but pseudo-crisis. Very important, just final words. Sorry if this takes a little bit too long time, people, but final word. Tellingly, of course, that when we have so much crisis around us, so much talk about crisis, the biggest crisis of them all, the climate crisis, just seems to disappear. Which, of course, speaks to the fact that these are discursive political discussions about what the ruling class want us to see as a crisis. The other thing is economic crisis. It's kind of interesting to think about, but we don't actually have an economic crisis right now. When we listen to politicians, it might sound like it, but it's not. The economy, of course, is creating a lot of poverty and all kind of problems, but it's not in a proper recession or a real crisis right now. But that will come. And this is maybe the biggest danger I can see in the near future, when that next crisis comes in, say, 5 years or 10 years or whatever. If we have the same kind of reactionary rulers in charge then, like we have now, or maybe more, ready to use the crisis to their advantage, I think that can be an absolute fucked up situation. Okay, maybe ending on a negative note there, but that was my final word. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ståle. Yeah, this was such a compelling presentation, and you're doing really important work. And just to go back to one of your key points, which is this rejection of the idea that ecological destruction will inevitably cause the economic collapse of capitalism, and arguing instead that destroying nature has been a massive business opportunity and continues to be so. Your theoretical approach has been helping me navigate my first weeks in Belém, in Brazil, where the next COP30 will take place in about a month, and where I'm connecting with you right now. And, I continue to think about how, even this notion of devaluation, how it is absorbed and repurposed by the capitalist system, rather than trigger its breakdown, which I think is one of your core arguments. And I look around here and I see so many billboards sponsored by, the mining and oil industries, and I'm following the lexicon, the rhetoric that is emerging here, especially around bioeconomy. And as we speak, there is an event dedicated to bioeconomy startups taking place here, energy transition. A couple of days ago, there was an event for business women. So a COP is really like is being perceived by a business opportunity as a business opportunity for local people and the others who are coming here. So I was just wondering if that is something you're also interested in this kind of setting, the COP meetings and issues of greenwashing and how that connects with how the capitalist system absorbs and repurposes devaluation and just thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing Gianfranco's questions as well. And I invite colleagues to contribute questions in the chat as well. And thank you again, Ståle.
Should I respond? Yeah, especially as a Norwegian right now, looking at the Equinor, the fact of so-called energy companies greenwashing is absolutely on my mind. I think it's very fascinating that these oil companies transformed into energy companies like, 4 years ago, trying to be green, especially Equinor, but also BP or whoever. And then maybe a year ago, just stopped doing it. And I think we must understand that the core here is not saving the planet or not. The core is profit. And that's 4 or 5 years ago, maybe they thought in case there were a green transition coming, they would be part of it. But now I think they're more realistically seeing that it is not, sorry to say. And then they just stopped bother. And I think it's very important to see, when we look at the world, we need to try to figure out which parts are more core-ish, which parts are more surface-ish. And the profit motive in capitalism is surely one of those core concepts and core drivers, which means that capital can operate quite differently. Some people, and at the same time, a lot of companies spend a lot of money trying to save the world, while other companies spend a lot of money to destroy it. And sometimes the same companies do both things. Because it's possible today to make money from both things, trying to save it and destroying it. Ironically, but not ironically if you understand the mechanisms of capitalism. So yeah, I think it's super interesting and good to hear that you're there and follow the process, Jamille.
Thank you, Ståle. I believe Charlotte has a question. And
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much to the hosts and also to Ståle. I really enjoyed hearing about your work and look forward to reading the book when I can get my hands on it. I have a question. So I also am writing my PhD on crisis. So I'm very interested in your approach to the concept. And I'm really compelled by the idea that we kind of have this soup of pseudo-crisis narratives that things going wrong or something not being quite right, that I think these pseudo-crisis narratives and also the concept of polycrisis help them to articulate and maybe point to. So to come back round to the question, I suppose it's about the sort of political and implications of your framework. So if you have a kind of real crisis and pseudo-crisis, how do you think that the kind of idea of there being a real crisis can really, how do you kind of convince people of that distinction when the idea that we're living in decline or something's very wrong, they might be turning to these pseudo-crisis narratives to kind of explain that? I don't know if that makes sense, but I suppose it's about how you how you kind of use the pseudo-crisis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you mean politically on societal level or individual people with crisis?
Politically and socially, yeah.
Yeah. Because on the individual level, what I think you start speaking about is a little bit different question, because people get divorced, for example, and say it's a crisis. But there's also sometimes reflections of people unconsciously reflecting with the words in society. So maybe 20 years ago, they would just call it like catastrophe, or I don't know, bad thing, or just divorce, what it is. But today they use the concept of crisis because it's so, as you said, in popular culture everywhere. Politically, with the pseudo crisis and real crisis, I think it is different. I think it makes political significant distinctions. In real crisis, I think we don't know how it will come, we don't know when, but we know there will be more economic crisis. People will lose homes again. People will lose jobs again. We need the plan to prepare for it. And my argument then is that we should be, like, the title of the book is Against the Crisis, so we need to have a socialist plan, or a socialist ready for action when it hits, which is our kind of socialist crisis, great destruction, or whatever we're going to call it, a socialist shock doctrine, or whatever we call it, to use an hour advance. Same with climate change. We know there will be more wildfires, there will be more heat waves. When it happens, when they come to news, we need to be there with our eco-socialist. I'm not sure if everyone says socialist, eco-socialist, but I'm not going to speak. I say we, just me and I don't know who, maybe you, or so, at least some here. I don't know if when Donald Trump will do whatever against trans people or immigrants, or etc. We know there will be racism, there will be all kind of problems, and there will be reactionary politics from far right. But it also, I'm also a little bit thinking out loud. Obviously, it's different phenomena, so we can't prepare in the same sense. But when it comes to far right riots, like we see in the UK, it's also about sticking together. Don't get it's not with real crisis. The left should join the hysteria a little bit to okay, it is a problem. We have a solution. Here's our crisis management, our crisis shock doctrine. With pseudo crisis, it's more about calm the fucking down. Stay calm. Don't let them tear our communities apart.
Thank you so much, Ståle. I just wanted to check in with Gianfranco and see if he has some questions too. We have quite a few in the chat, but
if I can jump in. I know we have really interesting questions, and I want to thank Ståle again for joining us today. I just want to go back to I think it's can you guys hear me well? Yeah, okay, cool. I just want to go back to the idea of class, because I think it's something really interesting you push in the book, and is the idea of the climate crisis as a form of class struggle, which in the book, and I go back to my notes, you describe eco-socialism, as you mentioned right now, can transform crisis into class struggles from below. And I know you in the book lay out that in the epilogue, and you mentioned you have really interesting points to tackle that issue. So can you talk about that briefly, if it's possible in some sense?
Yeah, and it speaks a little bit to it speaks a little bit to the last question about being prepared. I think if the working class or environmental movement is not prepared, it's absolutely impossible to win a crisis, unless something extraordinary happens, which might, but normally don't. But if we are prepared, know that there will be a crisis, and try to figure out what can a socialist plan for the next. It includes stuff like, okay, when there is a crisis, especially if we try to combine this crisis, if there's crisis in the economy, which kind of companies do we want to see nationalized? What kind of companies do we want to see shut down? Which kind of companies do we see get over to workers owned? If some companies go bankrupt, what do we do with those, etc. If we have planned for that before the crisis, it's possible to launch the plan when the crisis is there. It's impossible during a shock to come up with those kind of ideas. So I think in that sense, there might be some kind of hope or possibilities for working class struggle in the crisis. For example, and it goes through all these kind of, you could take the same part of the problem, but we also cannot avoid planning. So we cannot avoid planning for what we cannot know, basically. Problematic, but that's where we are. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ståle. So We have some really interesting questions in the chat that I think we could read from. For example, about whether you agree the ex-Soviet bloc had a fair share of political and environmental crises, and then he adds, if crises reproduce capitalism, what is the way out? Would you like to respond to that?
On the Soviet bloc, there's two different questions, and take the first. On the Soviet bloc, I'm not an expert on the Soviet bloc, but I do discuss a little bit. And they did have their crisis, but as they didn't have, and I take this from Elmar Altvater in his book about crisis in the early 90s, where he couldn't avoid discussing the fact that half the world just disappeared politically because of the fall of the Soviet Union, geopolitical crisis. He say that the massive distinction between the West and the East and back in the days were the fact that Soviet Union didn't have this relative autonomy between different spheres. So when there were an ecological or economic crisis in Soviet Union, people will look to the politicians because politicians said that this is democratically somehow, and they will look to politicians and say, like, fix it, or to the state and say, fix it. Same thing in dictatorships today, like in Assad, Syria, when there was problems in 2014 with food distribution and heat waves, people looked to the government who couldn't, because it was supposed to, there was no relative autonomy between the spheres. Look to the government, say, fix it, they cannot, and there's a riot. There's a revolution attempt. In capitalism, you have this relative autonomy between the spheres, which means that when it's the economic crisis, nobody points to politicians and says it's your fault, because it basically isn't. The economic crisis would have come independently of who actually is sitting in political power. Not only that, but also political leaders can say it's not our fault, but we will fix it for you. We will be through this hard time. We gather a nation, rally around a flag, which means me, the prime minister, and I'll fix this for you. Which can go both ways, but that's often the rhetoric you find. So there's a distinction between the political system and the economic and ecological crisis, which makes it easier for politicians to reproduce society through this crisis. What's the way out? Well, this is not an easy question, but it also speaks a little bit to Gianfranco's and Charlotte's question and my answer. My argument is that crisis reproduces capitalism. And this is not, I insist, this is an historical fact. It's happened historically so many times that we cannot avoid speaking about it. It's happened over and over again. So we need to understand, okay, why? But then, of course, next question is the good question that Reza has is, of course, how do we get the fuck out of here then, if that is the tendency? So I insist, this is not an iron law, it's a tendency. And our job is to make a counter tendency to this, or an exception to this tendency, especially with the climate change, that the world has never seen before. And that takes a lot. And there's been some crises, of course, all crises are different. Sometimes, of course, the left or the working class has been a little bit more organized. Great Depression in the US maybe being the best example with the New Deal, but still surely reproduce capitalism, but in a more social way than you did, for example, after 73, etc. So there's space there, but of course, how to actually implement a radical change in a crisis hasn't happened before. But we need to do that. That's our task. It's not a small task, but it's our task. Thank you.
Right. So we have a set of great questions. We can take Irene Dietzel, which is a great talk. She would like to hear more about your take on collapse theories. Are they all wrong?
Yeah. So in the end, one collapse theory will be right? So one day capitalism will fall. There will be a reason for it. And that person who kind of said that, everybody will think she or he will be a genius, because that person managed to come up with the knowledge how capitalism collapsed. I insist it's impossible today to know how and when and why capitalism will collapse. So that person that in the future will be seen as this huge genius is basically lucky. That's my approach. So we don't know how capitalism will collapse, but will collapse by something. I argue that I cannot see any reason in the crises. So there might be collapse because of other things than crises, but I cannot see anything in the crisis I look at, the economic and ecological crisis, that leads towards collapse. That's basically my argument. And I see all the arguments of collapse coming out of economic and ecological crisis. I don't buy it. I don't see it. I see the opposite. That's happening every time. Through ecological and economic crisis, capitalism reproduced. So now we have, 1.5 or something degree. If we start speaking about 3-4 degrees, maybe everything burns up. So ecological crisis might lead to collapse at a very in that sense. But that's so far in the future. That's not politically relevant, I insist, for us now. But that, of course, might also be a path to collapse. But that's like, yeah, so long in the future is politically irrelevant. So what's politically relevant for us is that through capitalism reproduced also through climate change. Okay.
Thank you. The next question is Sumayas. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Expanding on your second narrative of crisis reproduces more opportunities for capitalism. Do you think it also works as a tool? Sorry, I just lost the question. So do you think it also works as a tool for erasure of identity, specifically in relation to indigenous principles and existence?
Good question. I haven't thought so much about it. I don't write about indigenous principles and existence in the book, but I can throw out an answer, but I'm not an expert here, I must say. But we do see over time, historically, that capitalism normally reproduces itself on a larger scale after a crisis. So it expands, and it expands its territorial, it expands geographically after a crisis. So we very often see like a solution to one crisis is to expand production into a new territory, etc., which obviously has had massive negative consequences for indigenous principles and existence over the last, say, 200 years. So in that sense, yes. But I'm not an expert, so I don't want to go more. I cannot go any deeper into it, and specifically in examples and stuff. But thank you.
Great. So I'm taking the next one is Irene Ruiz. She's asking, wants to hear your thoughts about how crisis discourse will manifest in the near future with the rise of AI, social media, addictive and polarizing algorithms, hyper-consumerism, and disinformation, and the impact this has on grassroots organizing, or how we can oppose the system. We need people power that is becoming more difficult to mobilize.
Yeah, again, also I'm not a social media expert at all, but there's all kind of, I must say, but also kind of relations are interesting here. One thing is the relation between AI and economic crisis. We shouldn't be surprised if an AI bubble that will trigger the next economic crisis, but that we cannot know. In terms of social media and AI and fake news and all that, it is a terrible, poor coincidence in time that global warming is escalating while fake news and AI and social media is also escalating. I think that's a very bad combination, to be honest. But yeah, we need. One part of me hates social media through and through. Another part insists that we need to be there to have a counter narrative, etc. And I think that's the politically most important, to try to jump into those kind of platforms as well, to have a fight even there. Yeah, but just half of me thinks that. But I think it's the smartest half of me who thinks that.
Okay, so let's check the next one, and is over. Just give me a sec over here. Kanchanas, Ståle, thank you for the talk and for forcing us to be attentive to the underlying processes when discussing crisis or polycrisis. However, she asks, did I understand that you said that there is no economic crisis currently, although it may be imminent? Did I get that correctly? If so, Kanshana wonders where you would locate how the UNDP identified in 2022 how some 54 countries are going through or will be facing a debt crisis. This crisis for many countries in the global south is ongoing, and say this as Sri Lanka, which is Kanshana's birth country, and in Europe, Varoufakis would argue that Greece's debt crisis is still unresolved. Hence, she wonders the rationale to say that an economic crisis is yet to unfold, and that's an open question to that.
Yeah, very good question. So first off, when I say there's no economic crisis, yes, this is I'm speaking about Europe and the globe, the capitalist core. I should have mentioned that more explicitly, maybe, but that was what I was thinking about. But even the global south, say for example, stuff like you say, I think it's a good question, but the debt crisis have been, do you say ongoing or something? And just because something, this is very important in my argument, that just because something is not a crisis doesn't mean it's not bad. So I insist, for example, poverty is not a crisis, doesn't mean poverty is not bad. So if this has been, so just for the sake of the argument, the debt crisis would be a proper crisis, but just for the sake of the argument, if there's a problem with debt creating poverty over like 50 years, the question is, if this has been a permanent phenomenon for like 50 years, is crisis theory the best, or the concept of crisis, the best way of trying to understand it? Or is it other mechanisms in capitalism we should use to try to understand this phenomenon? If you know what I mean. So it doesn't mean that it's less important, it's like maybe we should use other concepts to understand what's going on. I often get the question of the genocide in Palestine, is that a crisis? And it can be argued yes and no, of course, depending on which kind of things you look at. But same thing, if you want to understand, this is a different argument than the question, I don't know, but just for the sake of argument. So just because something as bad as genocide is happening doesn't mean it's a crisis. And also, do we need, to understand the genocide, do we need crisis theory? Or do we need to create theories of colonialism, racism, imperialism, etc.? I think the latter, for example. And the debt crisis still being unresolved. Yeah, this is also an interesting argument. How long can a crisis be unresolved before it's just normal? And this is also an interesting discussion because in 2008, this is a little bit different argument, a different answer to the question, but I think it's interesting. After 2008, we started speaking about interregnum. With the Gramsci, this was the period when the old is dying, but the new cannot yet be born. And people started saying that in 2008, waiting for the new to be born. And today, people who were not yet born when we started speaking about interregnum can drive cars. So adult people have been living their whole life in interregnum. So at some time we should ask, okay, if there's still an unresolved crisis, or is just this the new shit? And what I think we're doing now is so much when we think about especially economic crisis, but politics in general, we're obsessed by the 20th century. And I think we should try to stand with both feet in the 21st century, but that's difficult because we are scholars, we are students of the 20th century. So what we are thinking about, this isn't the question for your answer maybe, but sorry. But what we are thinking about with why we are still using this concept of interregnum, waiting for something to replace neoliberalism, is because we're thinking with the 20th century, where Fordism has a very distinct beginning and a distinct end. The way in and out of Fordism, from laissez-faire Fordism and Fordism to neoliberalism, was distinct periods with distinct crises, which can be located in fairly short time, and came with massive differences in the different regime of the accumulations. So we're still waiting for a similar kind of break. But maybe it's not. Maybe the 21st century don't come up with that kind of breaks. Maybe we are in a period now more like the 19th century, with Marx's time, with a crisis every 10 years, some kind of capitalism more or less reactionary, just going over decades, where the more important or more interesting temporality with the crisis was every 10 years, rather than every like 40 or 50, which was the great waves, which we know from the 20th century. Yeah, so it's a question, how long can we speak about an unresolved crisis? And I think we should especially with the crisis of neoliberalism, start rethinking that to get out of the mindset of the 20th century, maybe. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you so much, Ståle. I'm conscious of time. I wonder if you or Gianfranco have any final comments.
I can leave it there. But thank you so much, Ståle, and thank you everybody for your fascinating questions. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamille.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gianfranco. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Very nice.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.